The clink of silver on bone china was the only music that mattered. Maya moved through it, a ship navigating a calm but treacherous sea of quiet wealth and unspoken demands. The dark red of her uniform was a slash of color in the restaurant's muted palette of cream and gold, the starched white of her apron a crisp surrender. She refilled a water glass without being asked, her movements economical, practiced. She was good at this, at the art of being present but invisible. Tonight, the air was different. It crackled with a low-frequency hum of tension emanating from the corner booth. The man seated there was the source. He wasn't loud or ostentatious like the tech bros who liked to flash their watches. He was perfectly still, a study in lethal composure. His suit was a dark, custom-tailored charcoal, the kind of fabric that absorbed light. A sliver of intricate, blue-black ink coiled just above the stark white collar of his shirt, a hint of a story written on his skin. His hands rested on the table, one on either side of a glass of untouched whiskey. They were elegant, clean, but they looked like they knew how to break things. Maya had seen men like him before, men who moved as if the world owed them space and silence. They came to Mizuki for the privacy, for the way the staff knew not to see or hear anything of importance. Her job was to serve them, to smile placidly, and to forget their faces the moment they left. She approached the table, her bottle of chilled spring water held ready. The man's two companions were stiff, their own expensive suits looking like costumes by comparison. They spoke in low, urgent tones, but the man at the center said nothing. He simply listened, his dark eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "Excuse me, sir," Maya said, her voice pitched at the perfect volume of polite interruption. "More water?" The man didn't look at her. He made a dismissive gesture with his fingers. One of his companions nodded curtly. As Maya leaned forward to pour, careful not to let the bottle touch the rim of the glass, the still man finally spoke. He didn't speak to her. He spoke to the man on his right, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. The language was Japanese, the tone sharp and utterly contemptuous. His eyes flickered over her form, from the curve of her hips to the fullness of her arms, a clinical, insulting assessment that lasted no more than a second. "The service is slow tonight," he said, the words cutting through the hushed air of the restaurant. "This fat girl is as sluggish as a cow. Tell her to hurry with the appetizers." A hot, familiar shame washed over Maya, the kind she'd learned to push down and plaster over with a professional smile. It was the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that she was not a person to be addressed, but an object to be commented on, a piece of furniture that wouldn't understand. But beneath the shame, something else sparked. A cold, quiet fury. She had spent 10 years of her life in Kyoto, her tongue shaping the sounds of that language until it was as much a part of her as English. She understood every syllable, every nuance of his disdain. She finished pouring the water, the stream as steady and silent as ever. She placed the bottle back on her tray with a soft click. Then, she straightened up, turned her head slightly, and met the man's gaze for the first time. His eyes were black, depthless, and for a split second, they widened in surprise that she dared to look at him directly. In flawless, formal Japanese, her voice clear and even, she replied, "My deepest apologies for the delay, sir. The yellowtail is being plated as we speak. I will bring it to you momentarily. Is there anything else you require in the meantime?" The silence that fell over the table was absolute. It was heavier than the thick carpets, more profound than the sound-dampening panels on the walls. The two companions froze, their faces a mask of shock. But it was the man in the center whose reaction was most profound. He didn't flinch or gasp. He simply went rigid, his stillness transforming from relaxed control to high-tension steel. The hand resting near his glass clenched, just once, the knuckles showing white. He stared at her, the surprise in his eyes slowly being replaced by something else, something colder and far more dangerous. It was the look of a predator that had just discovered the rabbit it was ignoring was actually a wolf in disguise. Maya held his gaze for a beat longer than was wise, a small, silent rebellion. Then she gave a slight, correct bow. I will return with your appetizer, she said, this time in English, for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. She turned and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs not with fear, but with a strange, exhilarating pulse of victory. She could feel his eyes on her back with every step she took toward the kitchen doors. She had broken the unspoken rule. She had seen him, heard him, and shown him that she was not invisible. She did not know it yet, but that single, defiant sentence had just shattered the carefully constructed wall of her ordinary life. Her world was no longer her own. The man in the corner booth, the man whose insult she had returned like a volley in a battle she didn't know she was fighting, had decided that. And what he decided happened. The rest of the meal was a masterclass in tension. Maya brought their food, cleared their plates, and refilled their drinks, all under the man's unwavering scrutiny. He said nothing more, not to her, not to his companions. He simply watched. Every time she approached the table, the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a silent, simmering energy. It felt like walking through deep water. When it was time for the check, she placed the leather billfold on the table. He reached for it, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric second. His skin was cool. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He paid in cash, a stack of crisp $100 bills that was more than triple the amount of the bill. It wasn't a tip, it was a statement. A display of power. As she cleared the last of the glasses, she saw it. Tucked beneath his whiskey glass, which remained untouched, was a small, precisely folded piece of paper. It wasn't a napkin. It was thick, expensive stationery. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up. She unfolded it beneath the lip of her tray, hiding the motion from the restaurant's cameras. There were only 4 words, written in clean, sharp English script. We aren't finished yet. A chill, entirely unrelated to the restaurant's aggressive air conditioning, traced its way down her spine. That was not a promise. It was a verdict. The next night, her shift ended in a downpour. Rain sluiced down the slick city streets, turning the neon signs into blurry watercolors. Maya pulled her thin coat tighter, the collar doing little to ward off the damp chill. She just wanted to get home, to the safety of her small apartment, to a cup of tea and the mindless comfort of a book. But as she rounded the corner of the alley behind the restaurant, she stopped. A black sedan was parked at the curb, its engine idling so quietly it was almost inaudible. The car was a void, absorbing the streetlights, utterly out of place among the dented delivery vans and overflowing dumpsters. A man stood beside it, holding a large black umbrella. He was one of the 2 from the night before. He didn't move towards her, didn't speak. He simply opened the rear passenger door, an unambiguous invitation. It was an order disguised as a choice. She could run, scream. She could dart back into the relative safety of the restaurant. But she knew, with a sinking certainty, that it would only delay the inevitable. Running would make her look guilty, and she had a terrifying feeling that looking guilty to these people was a death sentence. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought of the note. We aren't finished yet. She took a breath, the damp air filling her lungs, and walked toward the car. She did not run. Competence under pressure, her old self-defense instructor used to say, was just fear with a plan. Her plan, for now, was to walk into the lion's den and pray he wasn't hungry. She slid into the plush leather interior. The door closed with a soft, heavy thud, sealing her in, cutting off the sound of the rain. The world outside vanished. The car smelled of clean leather and something else, a faint, masculine scent of cedar and smoke. The man from the night before was waiting for her inside. Rio. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring out the window at the rain-streaked city, his profile carved and impassive. The ambient light of the city caught the sharp line of his jaw, the severe cut of his hair. Tonight, he wore a simple black cashmere sweater, the dark ink of his tattoos stark against the skin of his neck. Where are we going? Maya asked, her voice steadier than she felt. To a place where we can speak without being overheard, he said, still not looking at her. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, gliding into the stream of traffic. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Maya watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood slide by, feeling like a ghost observing a life she used to live. They drove for 20 minutes, heading downtown, toward the glittering spires of glass and steel where the city's real power resided. The car descended into a private underground garage, stopping before a discreet elevator. His penthouse was on the 80th floor. It was less a home and more a statement of absolute control. The walls were stark white, the floors polished concrete. The furniture was minimalist, brutally expensive, and arranged with geometric precision. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the entire city like a conquered territory, a sprawling map of lights glittering in the dark. He walked to the window, his back to her. "How do you speak my language so fluently?" he asked. The question was flat, devoid of curiosity, demanding a fact. "My father was a diplomat," Maya said, keeping her voice even. "We were stationed in Kyoto for 10 years. I grew up there." He was silent for a moment, processing this. A diplomat's daughter, waiting tables, it wasn't a question. It was a dismissal of her story. "My father passed away. His world, his money, it wasn't mine. This is my life now." He turned around slowly, his eyes finally settling on her. They were just as cold and assessing as they had been in the restaurant, but now there was a sharp, analytical intelligence behind them. He was trying to solve a puzzle. "You are either telling the truth, or you are the most convincing liar I have ever met. In my business, the two often look the same." Before she could respond, a phone on a low-glass table buzzed, a harsh, intrusive sound in the quiet room. Rio's eyes flickered to it. He picked it up, his entire posture changing. The controlled calm evaporated, replaced by a rigid, dangerous focus. He listened, his face hardening into a mask of stone. "Where?" he bit out. He listened again, his jaw clenching so tightly a muscle jumped. "Find them," he ended the call, his thumb pressing the screen with enough force to crack it. He didn't put the phone down. He hurled it. It hit the far wall, shattering into a spiderweb of plastic and glass. The violence of the act was shocking in its suddenness. He swore a low, guttural sound and gripped the edge of a marble console table. His knuckles were white. Through the fine knit of his sweater, Maya could see the fabric pull taut against a raised, jagged line of scar tissue on his side. He seemed to forget she was there entirely. His gaze was distant, haunted. "Akari," he whispered, the name a raw wound in the air. "I failed. I wasn't there." The name hung in the sterile, silent apartment. It was the key, the one vulnerability he carried. The woman he had failed to protect. The shame he carried like a shroud. In that moment, he wasn't a monster. He was just a man, drowning in a memory. Maya didn't think. She acted. The shattered phone lay in pieces on the polished floor. It was a mess, a tangible representation of the chaos that had just broken through his iron control. Ignoring every instinct that told her to stay still, to make herself small, she walked past him into the kitchen. It was as sleek and sterile as the rest of the apartment. She found a dustpan and a small broom in a utility closet. When she returned, he was still standing in the same spot, staring at the wall where the phone had hit. He looked up as she knelt, the sound of the broom's bristles against the concrete floor seeming impossibly loud. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She swept the larger pieces of glass into the pan, her movements deliberate. It was a simple, ordinary act. Grounding. "Leave it," he said, his voice rough. She ignored him, continuing to sweep the smaller, glittering shards. He moved then, crossing the space between them in 2 silent strides. He bent down, his hand closing over hers, stopping the motion of the broom. His grip was firm, inescapable. "I said leave it." His hand was warm, his thumb resting against the pulse point on her wrist. Her heart was beating a frantic, unsteady rhythm. She looked up, and her breath caught. They were inches apart. She could see the faint lines around his eyes, the subtle complexity of the ink at his throat. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of her own heartbeat, with the heat of his hand on hers, with 1,000 unspoken things. That is when the alarms began to shriek. A piercing, high-pitched wail filled the penthouse, accompanied by flashing red lights. Rio was on his feet in an instant, pulling her up with him. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a chilling, predatory focus. "They found me," he said, his voice low and urgent. He was already moving, pulling her toward a section of the wall that looked like a bookshelf. He pressed a spot, and the entire unit swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. "And they saw you arrive. As of right now, you are no longer a civilian. You're a liability." He pushed her into the darkness of the service corridor. "Stay behind me. Do not make a sound." The heavy panels swung shut behind them, plunging them into near total blackness and the immediate, terrifying reality that her life was now inextricably bound to his. The service corridor was tight and smelled of dust and cold concrete. Rio moved through the darkness with a predator's certainty, one hand gripping Maya's arm, pulling her along behind him. He didn't need light. It was as if he could see the path through sheer force of will. Below them, they could hear the faint sound of shouting and the splintering of a door. They had breached the apartment. They emerged into a sterile, white maintenance stairwell. Rio didn't hesitate, taking the stairs down 2 at a time, his grip on her relentless. The wail of the alarms was fainter here, but the sense of urgency was a live wire between them. They descended 10 flights before he pushed open a door leading to another underground parking level, this one for service vehicles. A sleek, black sedan sat waiting, identical to the first one, its engine already running. A different driver, a man with a shaved head and a grim face, sat behind the wheel. He didn't speak, just nodded as Rio shoved Maya into the back seat and slid in beside her. The tires screeched as the car shot out of the garage and into the rain-slicked belly of the city. "They were waiting," Rio said, his voice a low growl. He was scanning the street, his body coiled like a spring. The breach was too fast. Someone on the inside. Maya's mind was reeling. The insult in the restaurant, the note, the shattered phone, the alarms. It was all a blur of escalating danger. She was in a car chase with a Yakuza boss whose enemies now thought she was important enough to notice. That's when she saw the headlights. 2 of them, gaining fast. A heavy black SUV, built like a tank. "They're on us," the driver said, his voice calm. Rio swore under his breath. "Lose them." The car surged forward, weaving through late-night traffic with terrifying precision. Horns blared. The world outside became a smear of light and color. Maya gripped the leather seat, her knuckles white. The SUV stayed right on their tail, a relentless shadow. A window on the passenger side of the SUV rolled down. Maya saw the muzzle of a gun, the flash of fire. The sound was a deafening crack. The bullet whizzed past, hitting a street sign with a metallic ping. Before she could even process the sound, Rio moved. In one fluid motion, he grabbed her, hauling her down onto the seat, his body covering hers like a shield. The weight of him was immense, solid, pressing the air from her lungs. His arm was a steel bar across her back, his head tucked near hers. She could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her cheek, smell the cedar and smoke of his skin, feel the heat radiating from him. It was the most terrifyingly intimate moment of her life. Another shot rang out. This time, the rear window of their sedan exploded inward, showering them with a cascade of glittering, tempered glass. A sharp, stinging pain erupted on her cheek. Rio grunted, a low, guttural sound of pain. The driver took a hard right, tires screaming, fishtailing into a narrow industrial alley. The SUV, too large to make the turn at speed, shot past. For a moment, they were safe. "Are you hit?" Rio's voice was rough in her ear, laced with something she couldn't name.
"Panic."
"I don't think so," she stammered. "Just glass." He shifted his weight off her, and she pushed herself up, her body trembling. He was examining her face, his dark eyes intense. His fingers gently brushed her cheek, and she flinched. He pulled his hand back. "You're bleeding." Then she saw it. A dark, Wet stain was spreading across the sleeve of his black cashmere sweater, just below the shoulder. "You're the one who's hit." He glanced down at his arm as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It's a graze." The driver had already navigated a labyrinth of back alleys and was pulling into a dilapidated warehouse. The great metal door rolled shut behind them, plunging them into a cavernous, dusty darkness. This was a safe house. It smelled of rust and old oil. "Get the kit," Rio ordered the driver. The man returned with a metal box. Inside was a sterile field, sutures, antiseptic. "The medic is compromised," the driver said grimly. "He was seen with Tanaka's men this afternoon." Betrayal. The word hung in the air. Rio stared at the medical kit, then at his arm, which was now bleeding freely, dripping onto the concrete floor. He couldn't stitch the wound himself, not on his dominant arm. There was no one else. Except her. He looked at her, his expression grim. "Can you do this?" She looked from his face to the bloody wound to the needle in the kit. She had never done anything like this in her life. Her mother was a trauma nurse. Maya had spent her childhood watching her practice on oranges, her stitches neat and precise. But this was not an orange. This was the arm of a dangerous man who had dragged her into his war. Helping him was an act of complicity. It was crossing a line she could never uncross. "I can't just leave you to bleed out," she said, the words surprising her. She took the kit. "Boil some water. And find me a lighter." Her hands, which had been trembling moments before, were now strangely steady. She laid out the tools on a clean cloth. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. He didn't flinch, just watched her, his jaw tight. She sterilized the needle in the flame of a cheap plastic lighter until it glowed red. She took a deep breath. "This is going to hurt." "I've had worse," he said, his voice flat. She pushed the needle through his skin. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't move. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. She remembered the looping motion her mother had used, the way she pulled the thread taut but not too tight. The stitches were clumsy, uneven, nothing like her mother's practiced work. But they held. They closed the wound. When she was finished, she tied it off and cut the thread. Her hands were covered in his blood. She had marked herself, had chosen a side. They sat in the echoing silence of the warehouse, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The driver was gone, standing guard outside. Rio was watching her, his injured arm resting in his lap. "You should have run," he said quietly. "When my man came for you, you should have screamed and run." "You think that would have stopped him?" she countered, her voice tired. "No," he admitted. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "In the restaurant. After I insulted you, you could have pretended you didn't understand. Walked away. Why didn't you?" She didn't have an answer.
Prida?
Defiance? A deep-seated refusal to be made small? "You assumed I was nothing," she said finally. "I wanted you to know you were wrong." He was silent for a long time. He leaned forward slightly, the shadows carving his face into sharp angles. The cold mask was gone, replaced by a raw, weary honesty. "You are a complication," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A variable I did not calculate. I have not had to calculate for a human variable in a very long time." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession of her effect on his perfectly ordered, violent world. It was an admission that she mattered. Before she could find the words to respond, his phone, a new one, produced by the driver, buzzed on the crate between them. He picked it up. His face went blank, then hardened into a look of pure fury. Without a word, he turned the screen toward her. It was a photograph. A live image, time-stamped just 2 minutes earlier. It showed the front entrance of her apartment building, the familiar brick facade, the cheerful blue awning. Standing under the awning was Tanaka, the rival boss, a man whose face she recognized from news clippings about gang wars. He was smiling, looking directly at the camera. The text below the image was simple. "We know where your pet lives." The threat was no longer about him. It was about her. They were targeting her to break him. Rio's hand clenched around the phone, and in his eyes, she saw not just rage, but the cold, terrifying promise of murder. He made this personal, Rio said, his voice dangerously soft. He will not live to regret it. The plan was already forming behind his eyes, a lethal calculation of violence and retribution. He stood up, his movements fluid despite his injury. Tanaka values the old ways, the old codes of honor. He sees them as a strength. I will use them to break him. He was going to arrange a meeting, a final confrontation on neutral ground. He intended to end the war tonight. You will stay here. You will be safe. Maya looked at the photo on the phone again, at the image of her own front door, now a symbol of a life she could never return to. Staying here, being protected like a fragile possession, felt like a different kind of death. She thought back, sifting through the years of serving the city's elite at Mizuki, listening to the hushed gossip of powerful men who thought she was just part of the furniture. Tanaka, she said, the name tasting like ash. I've heard that name. Whispers between two real estate tycoons celebrating a deal. They had been talking about the city's underworld, about the hierarchies and the players. They had mentioned Tanaka. They had mentioned his greatest shame. His daughter, Maya said, looking up at Rio. His only child. She was killed years ago, caught in the crossfire of a territorial dispute. Tanaka made a truce instead of seeking vengeance. The other family saw it as weakness. He sees it as a necessary sacrifice, but it's the one thing that haunts him. Rio stopped, turning to look at her. The murderous rage in his eyes was tempered by a flicker of surprise, of sharp, analytical interest. He was a man who dealt in leverage in weaknesses. And she had just handed him the most powerful weapon of all. How do you know this? Rich men talk when they think the waitress can't understand them, she said simply. I'm a very good waitress. He was silent, a new set of calculations running behind his eyes. He saw the path she had just illuminated, but he shook his head. No. The risk is too great. You stay here. He turned to leave, but Maya stood up. You think you can protect me by hiding me? They already know where I live. They know what I look like. There is no hiding. The only way I am safe is if Tanaka is no longer a threat. And you need me to do that. I don't need anyone. You're wrong, she said, her voice ringing with a certainty that startled them both. You're walking in there to fight a war of muscle and steel. But this war is about shame. It's about honor. It's a language you speak, but it's a language I understand, too. Let me come with you. He stared at her, a war raging within him. The strategist in him knew she was right. The man who had already failed to protect one woman was terrified of failing another. But looking at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw and the intelligence burning in her eyes, he saw that she was not a Kari. She was not a fragile thing to be shielded. She was a weapon in her own right. If you come, he said, his voice low and final, you do exactly as I say. You speak only when I tell you to speak. Is that understood? Understood, she replied. She was choosing this. She was walking into the fire willingly. The tea house was a pocket of serene tradition tucked into the heart of the city's most violent district. It was neutral ground, a place where blood was not to be spilled, according to the old codes. Tanaka had agreed to the meeting. He would bring 2 men. Rio would bring one, his grim-faced driver. And Maya. Inside, the air smelled of wet stone and green tea. Shoji screens divided the space, and a small, manicured garden was visible through a large window. Tanaka was already there, kneeling on a tatami mat. He was a broad, powerful man with graying hair and eyes like chips of flint. His 2 soldiers stood silently behind him. Rio walked in, Maya a step behind him. He moved with a liquid grace, his presence dominating the tranquil space. He knelt opposite Tanaka. The tension was a physical force, pressing in on them. You have become sloppy, Rio, Tanaka began, his voice a low rumble. Involving civilians. A woman. It is a sign of weakness. It was you who involved her, Rio countered, his voice cold and even. When you sent your men to my home. When you targeted hers. Tanaka smiled, a humorless baring of teeth. All is fair when taking what is owed. Your territory in the harbor is mine. You will cede it tonight, Or this girl will pay the price for your arrogance. He gestured with his chin toward Maya. This was the moment. Rio gave a barely perceptible nod. Maya stepped forward. All eyes turned to her. She was a waitress in a blood-soaked sweater, a civilian in a room of killers. She was utterly out of place, and that was her strength. She bowed her head, not in submission, but in respect for the place, for the ritual. She did not look at Rio. She looked directly at Tanaka. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and calm, her Japanese formal and precise. "I am told you are a man who understands sacrifice, that you know the cost of our world." Tanaka's eyes narrowed. "The girl speaks. I speak of things that are forgotten," Maya continued, her voice gaining strength. "I speak of the loss of a daughter, of a girl named Saki." The name landed like a stone in a silent pool. Tanaka flinched, as if he'd been struck. His soldiers shifted uneasily. It was a shocking, unforgivable breach of protocol to speak of such a personal, shameful tragedy. "You have no right," Tanaka snarled, his composure shattering. "I have every right," Maya said, her gaze unwavering, "because you seek to visit the same pain upon another. You would make Rio suffer as you have suffered. You would spill the blood of another innocent girl to settle a score over docks and shipping containers. Is that the legacy you wish to leave? To become the very thing that broke your own heart? Is there no honor left in you?" Every word was a perfectly aimed blow. She wasn't threatening him. She was holding up a mirror to his deepest shame. In that moment of pure, agonizing distraction, as Tanaka's rage and grief warred across his face, Rio moved. He wasn't a blur. He was simply there. One moment he was kneeling, the next he was on his feet, crossing the space. He didn't draw a weapon. He grabbed Tanaka's outstretched arm, the one gesturing toward Maya, and twisted. There was a sickening crack of bone. Tanaka screamed, a raw, animal sound of pain that had nothing to do with honor. Rio had not killed him. He had humiliated him. He had broken him in front of his men, using his own pain as the fulcrum. The war was over. Later, back in the penthouse, the city lights glittered below like a fallen constellation. The space was clean, sterile again. The shattered phone was gone. The alarms were silent. Rio stood before the vast window, his back to her. His injured arm was in a proper sling now, a dark shape against his chest. The cost of their victory was absolute. Maya could never go back. Her apartment, her job, the simple anonymity of her life, it had all been burned away in the fire of tonight's events. She had helped a man win a war. She had his blood on her hands and his enemies scream in her ears. "You should not have come tonight," Rio said, his voice quiet. "You would be dead if I hadn't," she replied, just as quietly. Perhaps he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Tanaka has ceded his territory. He has retired. The debt is paid. You are free to go. I will give you enough money to start a new life. Anywhere you want." He was offering her an escape. A clean break. He was trying to protect her, to undo what he had done. She walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor. She stopped just behind him, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. She could smell the clean scent of antiseptic and the familiar, faint aroma of cedar and smoke that was uniquely him. "And where would I go?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them. It wasn't about a destination. It was about a truth. Her place was no longer in the ordinary world. Her place was here in the shadows, with him. It was a choice. He turned slowly to face her. The cold, calculating mask of the Yakuza boss was gone. In his dark eyes, she saw the weary man from the warehouse, the haunted man who whispered a dead woman's name. But there was something else there now, something new. An acknowledgement. A recognition. "Here," he said, the word a quiet admission. He raised his uninjured hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they came to rest against her jaw. His touch was not a question, but a statement. It was gentle, yet absolute. A claim. Her old life was over, destroyed by his carelessness and her own defiance. But as his thumb traced the curve of her cheek, right where the glass had cut her. Maya knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that a new one was just beginning.